Have you ever felt like your life is just um, completely off track, like you're stuck or forgotten or even moving backward?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we've all had those seasons where it feels like you're just spinning your wheels.
Right. Well, imagine holding the highest degrees available, having the direct ear of the most powerful political leader on the planet, and having just absolute, unquestioned authority.
You're basically positioned to change history.
Exactly. But then, because of one wildly impulsive decision, you wake up the next day and you have to, like, shovel sheep dung in a barren desert.
Talk about a pivot.
Right. And you don't just do it for a week, you do it for 40 years. That is the ultimate career crash.
It really is.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into a really insightful sermon that looks at this exact scenario. It focuses on the ancient story of Moses in the wilderness, specifically from Exodus chapter 2.
But this isn't just a dry history lesson, right?
No, not at all.
Hmm.
The mission of this deep dive is to explore how the sermon frames what we think of as wasted time. It argues that those frustrating seasons might actually be God's workshop.
Which is such a paradigm shift.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the text starts by painting a picture of a guy who literally had the world at his fingertips.
Yeah, he was raised in Pharaoh's household.
Right. The sermon brings in context from the book of Acts, chapter 7, showing that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of Egypt. He's described as being mighty in words and deeds.
So we're talking about a prince with military training, architectural knowledge, massive political leverage.
Exactly. Humanly speaking, he is the ultimate candidate to liberate his people, the Israelites, who are currently enslaved. He has the access, the influence, everything.
And he has the desire, too. He feels this deep calling to help his people. But, having the calling and having the right character to actually execute it.
They're two very different things.
Absolutely. So Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and his internal tension just snaps.
He just loses it.
Yeah. He intervenes, but he does it entirely on his own terms. He takes justice into his own hands, murders the Egyptian, and then tries to just bury the body in the sand.
But there were witnesses.
Right. And when he realizes that, his entire manufactured life just collapses. He goes from being a prince of the greatest empire on earth to an exhausted fugitive sitting by a well in Midian.
It's total disorientation. I was thinking about this, and the best analogy I can come up with is a highly anticipated tech startup founder.
Oh, I like that.
Right. So imagine they've got the Ivy League education, the VC backing, a brilliant vision to solve a massive problem. But then their ego takes over.
Is that listening to the board?
Exactly. They believe their own hype. They force a premature illegal launch on opening day, bypass all the safety regulations because they just want the glory right now, and the entire company crashes and burns.
Just a spectacular disaster.
A completely self-inflicted disaster driven by arrogance. They lose the funding, face criminal charges, and get blacklisted from the industry.
That is a perfect modern parallel.
But that brings me to a really big tension point in the sermon. If Moses messed up so terribly by committing murder and taking justice into his own hands, how does the sermon justify this as part of a divine plan without, excusing the murder?
Yeah, that's the philosophical crux of the whole narrative. The sermon addresses this by drawing a really sharp distinction between God's will and God's providence.
Okay, break that down for me.
So it definitely doesn't soften the blow of the crime. His actions were morally wrong. He was trying to force a divine outcome using violent human methods.
So he was acting totally outside of God's revealed will.
Exactly. He lacked submission to any timeline other than his own.
But the sermon argues he wasn't outside of God's control.
Right. And that requires a really robust understanding of providence. The sermon quotes the theologian John Calvin here, who noted that men do nothing save at the secret instigation of God.
Which means what, practically?
It means that even when humans make incredibly selfish or sinful choices, the divine architect isn't caught off guard. God isn't up there frantically recalculating the route like a confused GPS.
Right, like, oh no, Moses ruined it, what do we do now?
Exactly. The framework suggests Moses' failure didn't derail the master plan. The failure was actually factored into the architecture of the plan itself.
Wow, so the startup crash wasn't just anticipated, it was mathematically necessary for what was coming next.
Yes, because there's this distinct biblical pattern the sermon points out. God consistently breaks a leader before he builds them.
Oh, like who?
Well, Joseph rotting in a prison before managing Egypt's economy, or David living in caves as a fugitive before sitting on a throne, Or Peter denying Jesus before leading the early church.
That makes a lot of sense. So Moses had zeal, but no dependence.
Zero dependence. If you put a man with that much arrogance in charge of a nation, he just becomes a tyrant. Before he can stand up to Pharaoh, he has to be broken of his Egyptian pride. He has to learn how to kneel.
It's just a devastating reality check. But going back to that startup founder analogy, when you crash a company that spectacularly, you don't just, like, go to a weekend yoga retreat and bounce back.
No, the fallout is massive.
Right. Moses isn't just taking a quick sabbatical by that well.
Yeah.
He is sitting in the dusty ruins of his ambition for a staggering amount of time.
Which leads us into the next phase, which the sermon calls the School of Midian.
And the shift in his environment is absolute, from palace to pasture.
Yeah.
He trades military command for tending sheep. And the sermon highlights a really surprising detail here.
What's that?
It says Moses was content to dwell in Midian. He marries, has kids, and just settles into this obscure nomadic life for 40 years.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, and I have to push back a little on behalf of the listener.
Sure.
40 years of watching sheep.
Yeah.
In our modern optimization-obsessed mindset,
Yeah.
it feels like an extreme waste of talent.
It sounds crazy today.
Right. I mean, why does the sermon argue that God needs 4 entire decades to teach one guy a lesson? It comes down to a core concept the sermon identifies as formation before function.
Formation before function.
Exactly. We live in a society obsessed with function. We want an audience, a platform. We want to do something important immediately. When we pray, it's usually, use me.
But the sermon is saying God is more concerned with who we become.
Yes. The divine priority is, let me shape you. Moses didn't need another leadership seminar. He needed his ego dismantled.
And you can't really dismantle an ego when you're in the spotlight.
No, you can only do it in obscurity. When you're a prince, everyone obeys your commands instantly. But sheep don't care about your royal pedigree.
They're not impressed by the Ivy League degree.
Exactly. Tending them requires a slow, frustrating, daily dying to self. And the sermon points out how deeply this changed Moses, specifically when he names his son.
Oh, right. He names him Gershom.
Which means sojourner in a foreign land.
So he's naming his kid after his own displacement.
Yeah. He's losing his earthly identity. He knows he's not the prince of Egypt anymore, but he's not truly a native Midianite either.
He's just stuck in the middle.
Right. And the sermon suggests this is how God works, stripping away those earthly labels so his core identity can be anchored in God. And what's fascinating here is that God does his deepest work in the perfectly ordinary.
Yeah, that really struck me. Because usually we expect wall-to-wall miracles. But for 40 years, there's no burning bush, no parted seas.
Just waking up, finding water, dealing with family and stubborn animals.
The unglamorous grind, which makes this so relevant for you, the listener. We're always looking for that dramatic turning point. But the sermon emphasizes that real character formation happens in the mundane.
The quiet obedience. The job that feels completely unnoticed. Those days aren't a waiting room, they're the workshop where you're being forged for your purpose.
But here's the crazy tension of the story. While Moses is getting this slow drip character formation in the quiet desert, things back in Egypt are escalating horribly. It is not quiet there.
Not at all.
The sermon pivots back to Exodus 2.23. The king dies, but the slavery just continues.
It actually intensifies. The Israelites are pushed to the brink, groaning and crying out. There are 0 human solutions left.
It's like being on hold during a 911 emergency call. The situation is dire, you're screaming for help, and from your perspective, there's just dead silence on the other end of the line. Where is God in this?
It's the ultimate question, right? Justifying God in the face of suffering. And the sermon points to the very next verses for the answer. It highlights 4 specific verbs that change everything.
Okay, let's go through them. What are the verbs?
God heard, God remembered, God saw, and God knew.
Wow. Okay, so God heard means the cries weren't just vanishing into the void.
Right. He wasn't deaf to it.
And God saw. He wasn't distracted. He was witnessing the brutality.
Exactly. But the second verb, God remembered, is really important to clarify.
Yeah, because in modern English, remembering implies you forgot something first.
Like he just woke up and went, oh no, the Israelites. But in biblical Hebrew, the sermon explains that to remember is an active covenantal term.
Meaning what exactly?
It means activating a formal promise. God is bringing to the forefront the ancient contract he made with Abraham. He's initiating the rescue protocol.
Okay, so he's pulling up the contract, and then the fourth verb, God knew.
This is the Hebrew word yada. It doesn't just mean knowing a fact. It signifies intimate experiential knowledge.
Like a parent feeling their child's pain.
Yes, the divine creator intimately feels the agony of his people.
But that creates a massive friction point.
Yeah.
If God hears, remembers, sees, and intimately feels the pain, why the agonizing delay? To a slave in Egypt, he is 400 years late.
And this is a huge comfort for anyone in a season of silence right now. The sermon stresses that God's delays are not his denials.
Delays are not denials.
Right. We operate on this anxious, microscopic timeline. We want immediate fixes, but God is actively orchestrating the entire board.
So even when it looks like stagnation, it's actually preparation.
Exactly. He's forging the character of Moses while simultaneously positioning the geopolitical pieces in Egypt.
And all of this is building toward the climax of the Exodus. But the sermon makes a really fascinating pivot here. It points out that the ultimate climax isn't actually about Moses at all.
No, Moses is just a signpost.
So what does this all mean? How does the sermon bridge the gap between this ancient historical narrative and the listener sitting in the pews today?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sermon applies a Christ-centered lens. Moses was a deeply flawed prototype.
Because he acted out of ego and took a life.
Right, and he fled in fear. But Christ is presented as the true deliverer. He moved in perfect obedience, willingly gave his life out of love, and faced the cross.
So the ancient Exodus is just a shadow of the ultimate rescue mission.
Exactly. And the sermon concludes by bringing all of this to the communion table.
The bread and the cup.
Yes, and it makes this beautiful point. The table isn't for the self-sufficient or the people who have perfectly managed their lives.
It's a hospital for the needy.
For people who, just like Moses, tried to force their own destiny and made an absolute mess of it. The cross is the ultimate proof of those four verbs. God hears, remembers, sees, and knows.
And he steps into history to deliver us from sin and judgment. That's incredible.
It really reframes everything.
It does. Okay, to quickly recap the main takeaways for you listening. Number 1, your failures are not final. You haven't ruined the master plan. Number 2, those obscure, frustrating waiting seasons. That is the workshop. Formation before function.
Absolutely.
And number 3, God's delays are not denials. He remembers his covenant.
It brings so much existential comfort. But, the sermon ends with a really provocative thought that builds on all this.
Oh, what is it?
So the sermon emphasizes that the wilderness was necessary to strip Moses of his Egyptian pride, to teach him to be a humble sojourner.
Right, he had to be broken.
But think about your own life. Once you finally endure that wilderness and reach your promised land, once you get that career breakthrough or that deliverance you've been waiting for, how do you actively maintain the humble heart of a sojourner? How do you ensure that in your success, you don't slowly turn into the very Pharaoh you were rescued from?
Wow. Surviving the desert only to be poisoned by the oasis. That is a heavy question. But it's exactly what we need to be thinking about. So if you're feeling stuck right now, remember, you might just be in the workshop. Keep going.